The last section that we're going to look at in terms of looking at graphical representations of data for now is time series graphs. So time series graphs are a type of line graph that show the variables change over time. And this is very important. Whenever you have something that's to do with time, a time series graph is the best way to show what's happening. There's a couple of different things that we look at. We tend to look at long-term trends. So a long-term trend is looking at the nature of the graph over the entire length of time shown. So is it increasing or is it decreasing? Is there any points where if we've got two graphs, one of them is above the other, or one of them changes with respect to the other? Seasonal variation. So this is where we see a repeating pattern that changes with the seasons. So remember that you have time along the bottom, so we can see what happens in terms of each month. And if that repeats over a series of years, then we can say that that's a seasonal variation. We also have a cyclical variation, and this is where something's changing over time but it's not related to seasonal factors. So we could have where it's up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, and that's not necessarily due to seasonal variation, it could just be a cyclic variation. Also, we have a look at any spikes in the data. So are there any unusual high points or low points, or what is the highest point, what is the lowest point? And also, if we do have two sets of data, we can have an overall comparison between them. Is one of them always higher than the other, or one of them always lower than the other? So here, this bit here is very, very important. Every comment that we make has to be in context in terms of not only the units used on the side, but also the items described. So it needs to be in terms of those two things. So you can't just write down this is higher than this. You have to say what is going on. So we're going to have a look at an example of this. We're only going to look at ones where we have a single set of data. Remember that you could add extra comments in if you have two, saying which one is higher, and also if they are changing the same or differently over time. So here we have timber production. Up the side, our units is production in thousands of tons. So we need to make sure that we pay attention to that. That's our units that we're going to be using. And we've got timber production here. So we're trying to describe the variation shown in production of timber. Look at the long-term trend over multiple years as well as the trend within the year. So if we start off with the first point that we made before, long-term trend. So if we have a look at the data in general, we can see that every year it is increasing slightly. So the long-term trend of timber production, remember this is in thousands of tons, is that it is increasing over the 6 years from 2000 to 2005 inclusively. So that means that we include the year 2000 and the year 2005. If we have a look at the second comment, seasonal variation, well here we can see that we always have the low point of the year in January. Okay, so there exists, and we can see that also the highest point is always in April, followed by a lower point in July, followed by a slight increase in October, and then back down for January again. And because this is happening within the seasons, because these are what we call quarters, they have split the year into 4 pieces, we can see that this is definitely a seasonal variation, not a cyclical variation. So there is a seasonal cycle in the production of timber in thousands of tons. Each year, the lowest production happens in January, followed by the highest production in April, then a drop in production in July, followed by a slight increase in October. That's scribbling now. So we don't have a cyclical variation, we only have a seasonal variation. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to say that word. So we don't have an overall comparison because we don't have 2 sets of data, but we can have a look for spikes. So where is the lowest point? So if we have a look here, I can see that the lowest production in timber is 5,000 tonnes, and that happened in January 2000. So the lowest production of timber was in January 2000 and was 5,000 tonnes. Okay, and that's very important when you're talking about a spike, to not only say exactly when it happened, but also what the data was for the spike. One last comment about the highest production. The highest production looks to be this point here. So that's April 2005. So the highest production of timber was in April 2005, and from what we said earlier on, that's what we would expect, because we were saying over time it's increasing and we always have the highest point in April, and was about, because we can't see exactly from the graph, looks about 24,000 tonnes. Okay, now it looks like we've written a lot, but it only took a couple of minutes, not only for me to explain it and have a look at the graph and refer to that and the notes, but also to write it down. Now a question like this could be worth 4 or 5 marks, a mark for each point made, and maybe a mark for the context, making sure that you're talking about the timber production, making sure that you're talking about thousands of tonnes. Okay, making sure that you're making the correct references. I'd now like you to try and do the same with the ice cream sales. So pause the video and give the question a go. So hopefully you've given this a try now. The comments that I made was that there's a long-term trend of it slowly increasing. So the long-term trend is that the sales in Polar Cream Limited, millions of dollars even, are increasing slightly over the 3 years between 1997 and 1999, inclusively. There is also a seasonal variation. We can see that in the graph here, where the high point is always in the first quarter, followed by a dip in the second and third quarter, and then an increase in the fourth quarter. This time we don't have the months of the year, we literally just have the quarters that they split it up into 1, 2, 3 and 4. If from this we were to try and infer what the seasons were, well, because the high points are always in quarter 1, we could say that that's probably summer, followed by a dip in autumn, lowest in winter, and then a slight increase in summer. That's probably the way around that it is. However, they don't make any inference unless you're asked to do so. Don't say the high point is in summer and the low point is in winter. Say what's on the graph. Don't make an inference from it. Just read off from the graph. First quarter's the high point, third quarter's the low point. Don't try and interpret it at the same time, because that's going to end up losing your marks in the exam. Then for the lowest point, that's this one here, third quarter 1997, and that's 9, remember it's $1 million. And the highest point, we can see that's here, and that's in the first quarter 1999. And again, it's what we would expect from the first two comments that we made, that it is slightly increasing over time, and that the first quarter is always the highest one, and that's $22 million, and we can see that there, 22 million. Okay, so it's very important when you answer some of these questions that it does take a while to write, but it's always the same kind of things that you're writing about. What's happening over the length of the whole time? What's happening within the seasons or cyclical? What's the low point? What's the high point? And if you have two graphs on there, then make sure that you are doing a comparison. So if, for instance, we had, I'm just going to draw on it, it's just going to be a rough representation of something. If we had, for instance, the sales of suntan lotion, then you would expect the sales of suntan lotion to follow a similar pattern . Okay, so say if that was the data, and let's just say that the red line represents sales of suntan lotion, then we could say that the sales in suntan lotions follows a similar seasonal cycle as sales in Polar Cream Limited. And we can also say that most of the time sales of suntan lotion are higher than sales in Ice Cream Limited. However, for the third quarter and the fourth quarter of 1999, sales in suntan lotion dropped below sales of Polar Cream Limited. So that's an idea of how we could try to compare two graphs drawn on the same one. Say which is higher, say if it's following the same sort of cyclical thing, and again you could pick out high points and low points, but there's only going to be 1 or 2 marks available for pointing out high and low points. So don't give a blow-by-blow explanation of what each point is worth, because that's going to only get you a maximum of 1 or 2 marks in the exam. you're not going to get all the marks for telling me what every single point on there is. The idea of this is to read off the graphs, explain the important points, explain the important shapes in the short term and the long term. So just be careful with that. Thank you very much for listening.